Under the rotting wood of the staircase there was no dust, no forgotten coins, no misplaced shoes. There were only bones, small, fragile and countless, packed beneath each step like some grotesque insulation. She hadn't meant to find them. She only wanted to fix the creak in the hallway, the one that had echoed through her grandmother's house for as long as she could remember. But the moment the first plank came loose, the air changed. It was the kind of air that doesn't just smell old, it smells wrong. And when she saw what was buried there, she knew this wasn't just her family's house. This was her family's grave. The house had been in the family for over a century, passed from mother to daughter like a blood-stained heirloom. Its exterior was weather-beaten, the paint stripped away by decades of wind and rain, but the inside was worse, chokingly silent, as if even the walls didn't want to remember. People in town said the women in her family were keepers of the old ways. It sounded poetic, harmless, but she now understood it meant something else entirely. It meant secrets were not told, they were buried. Her grandmother used to tell her never to wander under the stairs, not the attic, not the basement, just that narrow space under the steps. "Things down there aren't for children," she would say, her voice firm but without explanation. It was an odd warning, one that had lodged in her memory like a splinter. And now, as she reached her trembling hands into the cavity beneath the stairwell, she realized her grandmother's warning hadn't been for her safety. It had been for the safety of the secret. The bones weren't fresh. They were yellowed with age, brittle enough to crumble at the edges. Some looked like the remains of small animals, but others had the unmistakable shape of human infancy. They were wrapped in scraps of cloth so decayed they seemed to disintegrate under her touch. She could see faded stitching, hand-sewn patterns, the kind of care someone might put into making something for a child. But these weren't keepsakes. They were shrouds. Her first thought wasn't of calling the police. It wasn't even fear. It was shame, an overwhelming, suffocating shame she couldn't explain. As if in disturbing these remains, she had violated something sacred or cursed. And deep inside she knew the shame wasn't hers. It belonged to the women who had come before her, the ones who had built this house step by step, bone by bone. She tried to tell herself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe the house had been built over an old burial ground. Maybe these were relics from some long-forgotten time when people hid valuables in strange places. But she knew those were lies the mind makes to avoid the truth. The truth was in the way each bundle of bones was arranged, deliberate, intentional, like pieces in a ritual that had been performed again and again. These weren't accidents. They were choices. The town itself seemed to know something, though no one had ever dared speak it aloud. There were whispers about the women in her family never marrying outsiders, about the strange lullabies sung late at night, about how no one had ever seen a male child live past his first winter. The stories had always sounded like superstition, old wives' tales woven to scare children into obedience, but superstition doesn't leave behind this many bodies. Her grandmother's room was still intact upstairs. The air smelled faintly of lavender and mildew, and the wallpaper was the same faded floral that had been there since before she was born. She searched for answers, letters, diaries, anything that might explain the horror she'd uncovered. In the back of the wardrobe, behind a row of moth-eaten coats, she found a small wooden box. It was locked, but the wood was so dry it cracked under her hands. Inside were more pieces of the puzzle, photographs of women she recognized as her ancestors, all of them staring into the camera with the same blank, unblinking gaze. There were no men in any of the pictures, only women and children, always the same number of children in each photo. And tucked between the photographs was a folded piece of parchment, the ink faded but still legible. It was a list of names. Next to each name was a date, and then another date, just weeks or months later. The handwriting was beautiful, precise, but the meaning was chilling. These were birth dates and death dates, entire lifespans reduced to 2 lines of ink, most lasting less than a season. She recognized her own mother's name on the list, paired with her birthday, but instead of a death date, there was an empty space. She didn't know what terrified her more, the fact that she might have been meant to die, or the fact that she might still be part of whatever tradition had filled those steps with bones. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps pacing just beyond her door. The walls seemed to breathe in the dark, expanding and contracting with the weight of the secrets they held. And from the staircase came a sound she couldn't explain. It was faint but steady, like a soft knocking from inside the steps themselves. She told herself it was just the wood settling, that old houses made strange noises at night. But the sound wasn't random. It had rhythm, almost like the beating of a heart. She lay there in the dark, gripping the edges of the blanket, feeling the weight of the generations before her pressing down on her chest. By morning, she decided she had to know more. She went to the oldest person in town, Mrs. Carver, a woman in her late 80s who had been the unofficial keeper of local history for decades. When she mentioned her family name, the old woman's face changed, her smile vanished, and she sat back slowly, as if something heavy had settled on her shoulders. Mrs. Carver didn't ask what she had found. She simply asked, "Did you open the stairs?" When the young woman nodded, the old lady sighed, her eyes clouding over. "Then you've called them back." According to Mrs. Carver, the women of her family had been bound by an oath, an old, blood-deep pact made long before the house was even built. In times of famine and hardship, when food was scarce and survival meant impossible choices, children were given back before they could grow and take from the table. They were buried under the stairs, so the family would always remember the cost of its survival. The pact didn't fade with time. It became ritual. The steps were rebuilt each generation, and each new woman who inherited the house added her own debt to the foundation. No outsiders could marry in, no sons could inherit, only the daughters carried the house, and the oath. Mrs. Carver leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "If you're the last, the bones will wait for you. They don't care how the blood is taken, only that it's paid." The young woman left without saying a word. But as she walked home, the wind picked up, and she could swear she heard that same faint knocking again, this time in her own heartbeat. When she returned to the house, the daylight seemed thinner somehow, as though it could no longer fully penetrate the windows. Dust floated in the air like ash, and the scent of earth, fresh, damp and wrong, was stronger than before. She went to the staircase again, crouching at the base. The boards she had pried up yesterday now sat loosely in place, almost as if the wood itself no longer wanted to hold them. This time, she pulled them up completely. The hollow beneath was deeper than she remembered, a narrow tunnel sloping downward. Her breath caught when she saw it wasn't just the steps that held bones. There were bones all the way down, stacked into the walls like bricks, winding further into the earth. It was a burial corridor, hidden in plain sight. She lit a candle and crawled inside, careful not to touch the brittle remains. The air grew colder with each foot she descended, and her own breath began to fog in front of her face. Then she saw it. A small archway at the tunnel's end, carved out of packed soil. Beyond it was a chamber no bigger than a pantry, and in its center stood something she didn't expect, a wooden cradle. The cradle rocked ever so slightly, though the air was still. She approached, her candle casting warped shadows on the dirt walls. Inside the cradle was not a child, but a bundle of bones wrapped in the same kind of stitched cloth she had found before. Only this time, the stitching was fresh, new. Pinned to the fabric was a slip of paper, folded many times. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was her mother's. The note was only 4 words long, "For when it's time." Her mind reeled. Her mother had been gone for years, buried in the town cemetery, or so she thought. But this note was proof she had been here, tending to the ritual, preparing for its continuation. The knowledge sank into her like a stone. She hadn't stumbled into a dead tradition. It was still alive, waiting. When she turned to leave the chamber, the candle flickered violently and went out. She was plunged into complete darkness. the kind that seems to hum in your ears, and in that darkness, from the cradle behind her, came the slow creak of wood rocking again. She froze. The sound of the cradle was steady now, deliberate, like someone was standing there pushing it back and forth. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. Then came another sound, soft, almost tender, a low humming, the kind mothers use to soothe crying babies. Only there was no warmth in it. It was cold, mechanical, and impossibly close. Her breath quickened. She tried to convince herself it was just her mind, just the oppressive, dark playing tricks, but the humming continued, and she could hear it circling the small chamber, moving behind her, then to her side. She stepped backward, her shoulder brushing against the dirt wall, and that's when her fingers touched something. Warm. She jerked her hand back, but the warmth clung to her skin, as if whatever she had touched had pulsed faintly in response. Her heart pounded in her ears. The air seemed to thicken, and suddenly the humming stopped. Then, in the silence, a whisper came, raspy, intimate, and female. "It's not paid yet." Panic took over. She dropped to her hands and knees, crawling blindly back toward where she thought the tunnel began. Her hands scraped over bone after bone, brittle pieces snapping beneath her palms. But the further she crawled, the more the tunnel felt wrong. It sloped in unfamiliar directions, as if the earth had shifted, as if the house itself didn't want to let her go. She started calling out, her voice cracking in the tight space. "Let me out." The only answer was a faint rustle ahead, like something moving toward her. She scrambled forward, her nails clawing into the soil, and finally she saw a faint line of light. Daylight. She lunged for it, bursting out from under the stairs and into the hallway, gasping for air. But the relief didn't last. The open boards gaped behind her like a wound in the house, and from that black opening came the unmistakable sound of the cradle, still rocking. She backed away slowly, but her heel caught on something. A small wooden box she didn't remember seeing before. It was identical to the one she had found in her grandmother's wardrobe, but this one was new, the wood smooth and clean. She opened it, and inside was a folded parchment. Her own name was written at the top. Below it, today's date. She stared at the parchment, her throat tightening until it hurt to breathe. The ink was still wet, smudging slightly beneath her trembling fingers. This wasn't an old record. It had been written in the last few hours, and whoever had written it hadn't just known she would be here. They had known she would find it. A sudden creak from above made her look up. The second-floor landing was empty, but the shadows seemed to stretch and ripple as though something had just moved out of sight. Then came the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps on the stairs, not descending toward her, but moving upward, deeper into the house, as if leading her. She followed, against every instinct, climbing each step as her heart pounded louder than the floorboards. The sound guided her to the attic door at the very top. She'd never been inside before. Her grandmother had always kept it locked, but now the door stood slightly ajar, and from within came the faint smell of soil and candle smoke. Pushing it open, she found the attic lit by dozens of candles, their wax pooled and hardened over years of use. In the center of the room was a large trunk, its lid open to reveal bundles of cloth just like the ones she had seen under the stairs. Some were decades old, but others looked fresh. Each bundle had a slip of paper pinned to it with names and dates that matched the death records from the box she had found earlier. And then she saw the last bundle. The fabric was pale, almost white, and inside it was not bone, but hair, a lock of her own hair, cut clean at the root. She stumbled back, her mind spinning. Someone had been in her room. Someone had taken this. Her gaze fell on the far wall where an enormous faded photograph hung crooked in a warped frame. It was of her family, women from every generation, all standing on the staircase. She could see her grandmother, her mother, and there, at the very end, a small, shadowed figure she realized with a jolt was herself as a child. But what froze her blood was the detail she had never noticed before. Beneath the staircase in the photo, through a small gap in the boards, dozens of tiny, pale hands were reaching out. As she stared, the candle flames flickered violently, and the room grew colder. The floor beneath her gave a subtle, rhythmic thump, like something was knocking from inside the wood again. The knocking grew louder, steady and deliberate, echoing up through the floorboards until it seemed to shake the entire attic. She backed toward the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The candles guttered, their flames stretching unnaturally toward her, casting long, warped shadows on the walls. In those shadows she saw them, small, hunched shapes, dozens of them, each with limbs too thin and heads too large, all tilting in unison as if listening. The thumping stopped. Silence pressed against her ears so hard she thought they might burst. Then, from the floor beneath her feet, came a sound far worse, scratching. Not random, frantic scratching, but careful, methodical scraping, as though many tiny hands were working together to open something from below. The wooden boards began to bulge upward, the nails groaning in protest. She stumbled backward until her spine hit the far wall, but there was nowhere left to go. The first board snapped with a sharp crack, and from the gap rose a pale, dirt-caked hand. Then another, and another. They weren't reaching for her at first, they were reaching for the bundles. The cloth-wrapped remains in the trunk shifted, pulled toward the hands like they were being claimed. One by one, the bundles vanished into the floor. The room smelled of soil and rot, and something older than death. Then the hands stopped taking the bundles and started reaching for her. She pressed herself into the corner, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The hands touched her ankles first, cold, impossibly strong for their size. She kicked free, but more came, gripping her wrists, her legs, pulling her down with steady, merciless force. She screamed, but the sound seemed swallowed by the house itself, muffled like a voice underwater. As the boards beneath her split open wider, she saw what lay below. Not a crawl space, not a tunnel, but an endless pit lined with countless staircases spiraling downward into the dark. And under each step, more bones. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was that same lullaby, humming from somewhere deep in the pit. This time she understood the words. It wasn't a song, it was a promise. The debt is paid.